Phil fails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phil fails at philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phil fails conception, perception, reflection, knowledge, experience, experiment. What did he learn in college? Phil fails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phil fails at philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phil Fails.
Welcome to Phil Fails. We're joined again by Grant Potts. Oh man, what was your title again? Grant Potts, super cool dude, professor of philosophy. I could look back here to it. What are you?
I'm a professor of philosophy, religion, and humanities. My primary training is as a religious studies scholar, but I also teach philosophy.
That's the title. All of that.
Yeah.
Today, Phil continues to fail at philosophy, and this is the book.
This is our book club, man.
This is Phil fails at book clubs.
At philosophy book clubs.
Philosophy book clubs. This is Phil fails at philosophy book clubs with Grant Potts. I'm really happy to have you here.
Right.
When we connected after our first interview, and you brought over 6 books, I was just so happy.
There were 9.
When you brought over 9 books. When you brought over 9 books, I was really excited. I mean, I'm still excited. And I think I was excited because there was an excitement you had.
Yeah, I love reading books with people.
You had an idea. You had an inertia or an idea of how this could continue. And I'm like, heck yeah. And then you proceeded to show me all the books. And I immediately wanted to choose the thinnest, skinniest book there was. The Plato book.
Yeah.
What's it called?
The 5 Dialogues?
5 Dialogues.
Yeah.
Because it was the skinniest book, and I didn't want to read much.
Yeah. Yeah.
We did not pick that book.
We did not pick that book. Should we show them what...
We should show them the book.
I don't know if this is going to be on the camera. Maybe over there.
Yeah, but put it wherever you want. I'll put some kind of like post-production thing.
Yeah, we chose Philosophy's Big Questions, Comparing Buddhist and Western Approaches, edited by Stephen M. Emanuel, published by... Columbia University Press. And should I say a little bit about what this book is?
Yeah. First, let's talk about how we got to the book.
Cool.
Do you remember? Can we remember when you came over and we talked about the 9 books?
I mean, I think we talked about the various types of books, and this one is both kind of a broader introduction with a bunch of questions.
And it's comparative.
It's comparative.
You talked to me about the lineage, the different lineages of philosophy, and then we talked about... what else did we talk about? But they can either be individual or it can be comparative.
Right. Many philosophers operate within some tradition, right? And when we think of philosophy, we are often, what people are thinking of is Western philosophy, what people call Western philosophy, right? And so... it's good, one, to know that not all philosophy is Western philosophy.
He actually talks about that in the beginning of the book, right?
In the introduction,
In the introduction, he's like, and I had that idea. I actually thought no one else in the world had any philosophical thought until they learned about it from the Romans or the Greeks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's my my...
I mean, it's like, when you think about it, you're like, why would I ever think that? But that's often whatever. And I have some colleagues who still hold that there is no philosophy that did not descend from Socrates, right? If it's not that, then it's thought, not philosophy. Yeah, and that's provincial, right?
Yeah,
it's provincial.
Because obviously human beings were growing and learning and evolving and maturing cognitively and socially in all the places around the world. And having questions about what does this mean and why are we doing this?
Right. And so, this is comparative between Western and Buddhist philosophy in particular. So we thought it'd be interesting to just sort of explore. The other thing I liked about this book is it's organized around a series of questions.
Yep.
Right. And so part of it is when you read a book like this, if you're trying to fail at philosophy, right, by reading this book, it's partly you're reading it to see what the people are educating you about and talking about, what they have to say, right? But part of what it is this question is a good opportunity to say, so what do I think about that question, right? Yeah. In the context of when you're reading what this person is saying, but like not just reacting to what they're saying, but, as they bring up these ideas, if that's a question that's interesting to me, how would I go about addressing that question? How would I go about thinking through that question myself? Yeah.
And in this chapter, and all of them, we're looking at it both through the Western lens and then through the Buddhist lens.
Right, exactly. That seems to be what the editor, what Stephen Emanuel, has set for the people who contributed. Another good thing to note about this is that each chapter is written by a different person.
Yeah.
Right. So not only are we going to get these comparisons, we're going to get 8 different voices as we go through.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And there's an obvious thing that we discussed before that we can discuss now in this more open forum, is that you're a skilled and educated and probably well-read human being, and I'm a human being. But of those other things with regard to philosophy, I'm not. Like,
right,
I'm not educated in philosophy. I'm not well read in philosophy. I'm not skilled in conversing philosophically.
Yeah. You're a skilled and educated person,
right?
But you're not skilled and educated in this particular topic. Beyond, I think you said you did take an undergraduate.
I did. It was the Intro to Modern Philosophy.
Yeah.
We started with Descartes.
Right.
Was that?
Yeah, which was one of the books we talked about. It was actually the skinniest book. That one was skinnier than the Plato.
Why didn't I pick that?
It is, it's beautiful, but it is good to read slow.
Yeah, oh my goodness.
I think it's like, in that translation, it's like 60 pages. When I do it in my class, my Intro to Philosophy class, we spend 3 weeks on it.
Yeah.
And we really do. It really does require that. So that's 6 class sessions. It does require like an hour and a half for each 15 pages to really figure out what he's doing there.
Wow. Yeah. And
or I guess every 10 pages. Yeah.
Yeah. And so as a result of this kind of variability of background,
right,
we kind of talked about how can we structure these conversations? Because obviously I could be educated by you.
Right.
And sit and listen and take notes. And you do that all the time as a teacher.
Yeah.
Of philosophy, and we want this to be something different. So some way of having a dialogue back and forth.
Yeah, I don't want to sit here and just do a philosophy lecture.
Right. So we're not going to do that.
If I want to do that, I just kind of invite you to class. You can set up the cameras there.
I could just audit
and I'm getting paid for that. So
yeah, I was paid for that class. But we're not going to do that. We're going to have kind of a fun, informal discussion.
Yeah.
That's what book clubs do.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And I plan on failing and saying silly things or things that, and you'll help me when there's an opportunity to be helped, or maybe I'll enlighten in some special way that, the uneducated stumbles upon.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. No, and it's actually not far from the way I try to teach my classes. I do think my life as a professor is a constant struggle to shut myself up and let my students talk.
Really?
Yes. Because I know when I do that, and they are able, especially when we're discussing what we're reading, and they're able to talk about it and explore that text in this kind of raw way that is not shaped by my years of education, which, a lot of it is very valuable, but a lot of it channels you into a very particular way of looking at the problems and things we're looking at. There's just so much good insight I get out of my students.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
awesome.
100% why I'm here is to hear what you can help me in thinking about this.
Well, I'm ready to do that. I'm gonna shine here momentarily and just remind everybody that philosophy means love of wisdom. This is one of the many words that I looked up in reading these books, and you mentioned it being slow reading through Descartes. I found reading through this stuff pretty slow for myself.
Yeah.
And I looked up a lot of words, and I read this chapter. We're on the first chapter titled "How We Should Live, Happiness, Human Flourishing, and the Good Human Life." Mm-hmm. right? I read it 1.5 times, which means practically I read, and both times I took notes up until the Buddhist section. I don't know what that means. That could be just like, am I racist? And why did I stop at the Western? Why did I start? I think it's because I didn't know in my brain how to pronounce a lot of the words that came up in the Buddhist section.
That's good. Yeah. No.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying.
And I wanted to, when I read books, I want to know how those words sound in my head before I move on.
Right.
Do you do that?
No.
Okay. So...
No, I mean, I really don't. And it creates problems sometimes because, I'll be teaching about, say, a concept that comes out of Sanskrit literature. And I'll be teaching about that concept for the first time. And I realize, I have no idea how to pronounce this thing because I've only read it. Because I had the exact same problem you had when I was a young undergraduate encountering all sorts of things. I remember it most in art history.
Yeah.
I was studying art history in a Renaissance to modern art history survey. And it wasn't even it wasn't Sanskrit, it was just Italian names, but I was I was not prepared by Ohio public schools to distinguish between Raphael and Donatello and Michelangelo. They're all just these Italian sounding names, right? And I couldn't remember them because I couldn't pronounce them and whatnot. Yeah. And so, I actually developed the habit of just reading past names I can't pronounce.
I think that's what I had to eventually do, because I would sit there and I'd be like, okay, there's all the pre-Vedic, and then there's the Vedas, and then there's post. And Veda was the easy one.
Right.
But then you had, in the Buddhist side, there seemed to be just a further breaking down of, numbers and lists of things. None of them I could pronounce in my mind. I'm not even reading this book out loud. But my mind, I feel like I'm shortchanging it by not giving.
Right.
But I need to. It's a necessity.
Yeah, I think there's some level at which there's a happy medium between the two, right? Between the my process of reading past. Although I do think so totally different kind of text. You ever read Burroughs, William S. Burroughs?
Yeah, Naked Lunch.
Right, yeah. So I taught The Ticket That Exploded when I was teaching English composition. This is 2 decades ago. It's a great book. It's one of his cut-up novels, though.
This is where he wrote a novel and then cut it up and then put it in a thing and then put it back in an organization.
Exactly. And so it is on one level completely incomprehensible what's going on, right? Because of the cut-up nature. It tells, I love the book. It tells the story in a different way.
You love the book.
Right. Because whereas, a standard kind of novel tends to be linear.
Yeah.
All that linear narrative is now cut up and fragmented throughout the text. Right. And so I realized at a certain point reading it that the story was being told in a rhythm, right? Mm-hmm. There's repetition, there's motifs that come back. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of more of this sort of wash of images and ideas and events and whatnot that are fragmented throughout the text. But I don't think there's a human way. Maybe someone who has a brain who can kind of hold more than me, that you can get that in the first reading. Mm-hmm. So when I taught it to my students, this was for a writing class, right?
Yeah.
But I was trying to show them different ways to relate to language, right? When I taught it, though, I said, just plow through it. Just plow through it. You're going to have to read this at least twice.
At least twice.
At least twice. But on the first read, plow through it, and then come back once your brain has had a sense of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
To
reorganize it. Is there some organization that needs to happen?
And it's for me and for many of my students as they did this, right, and their report to me, I only taught this for 2 semesters, so I've only got that small population of students talking to me about it. But both my experience and the one they shared with me was the novel just making an incredibly higher level of sense on the second reading. Because you don't have to be conscious of how your brain is starting to organize the information. You just have to like get it all there and let your brain do it. I mean, it's sort of like any other thing. Like if you're going to work on a building project, right? You're going to walk around the site and survey the site. So I do think in some ways, as readers, we often approach reading, because reading is taught to us so much as recreational reading as kids, partly because they're trying to get us to have fun, and you know, it's totally legit. I think that's probably the right approach, but there could probably be more just warning, like, hey, y'all, this is not actually how you read, right? This is like, if you really want to like get stuff down, that you do have to do this kind of survey first and then get into the weeds. So
reading it multiple times is a part of critical reading, or more. I
think
like,
so. And realizing
it's not
that
fun. Like, what's the opposite? Is it academic, or what is the opposite of like reading for leisure or recreation? Would it be?
I mean, I think it's still recreational, but it's not childhood recreational, right? You know, it still can be fun.
Yeah,
you just have to approach it differently. But I do, you know, I think this is an interesting thing to think about when we're talking about doing philosophy or any of these kinds of tasks. We do, and I see this with again, my students are often just like, they'll try to read Descartes or Plato or any of the other things that we read together, and they'll be like, "Professor, this book's terrible."
Yeah.
Right?
Oh my God.
It's no fun.
Yeah.
I don't know what this guy's talking about. Like, he's going off and this, and there's just part of me that's just like, yeah, I mean, this is a college class. It's not necessarily going to be fun, right?
Well, I'll just start off with, I read this whole chapter one and
then a half times,
and at no point did they answer this question.
I know.
At no point did they answer this question.
Right. Yeah.
I was like, what?
One, I think that's part of the game, right? You're not going to get clear answers. That's not the goal usually, right? It's not to say, all right, Philip, hey, look, here's the answer to this complex question that people have thought about for 3,000 years.
Yeah, why don't they just put it in the first sentence?
Right, here it is.
Here's the answer.
And then you don't have to read anymore. You know it.
This could be a simple chapter.
Right, because
it should just be like, just put it in big font.
Right.
You know, if you want to have a lot of pages.
Yeah, I think these writers have too much respect for you as a human being to do that.
They want me to get there on my own.
They want you to maintain your autonomy as a thinker.
Oh my God.
And think through it. And also like
that's a part of one of the Western sides, like having that autonomy or that agency. He talks about agency is a primary part of whether the virtue theory or maybe even the deontological theory was this, like, first you find agency, then something else happens.
Right. Right. I think that was during the deontology. But yeah, I think it's there in all three of the traditions he talks about there in terms of moral philosophy. But yeah, I think it's interesting because I don't... One question I have is like, what is he actually doing in this chapter?
Yeah.
Like,
what did you do? Well, first, let me first say the question a couple times because they said the question a couple different times and in a couple different ways. It was how we should live, happiness, human flourishing, and the good human life. And then they said it, they gave this same question in 3 or 4 different ways. How can I be happy? How can I live a fulfilling life? How can I find my purpose? How exactly can I achieve my ultimate end goal? How should I live my life? These all kind of living a morally appropriate human life. Yeah.
Good work.
Those were all of them because it seemed like they were asking this question a bunch of different times.
I think that's
a bunch of different ways.
I think that's really that's a really good way to tackle this. Is say, all right, one, and even thinking about this, like when I'm reading something like this guy who's writing this chapter, he says this is about how should we live.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that was his question or the question of the editor, like it's always that kind of question too.
Yeah.
But whatever the case is, but figuring out what he's getting at, going through and say, well, how does he rephrase this question? What does he think we're actually asking? Which I think is actually one of the more important ways to go about doing philosophy, right? Is to really think about the question.
Yeah, what is being asked here?
And is this the question I want to ask? Is this the question I intend to ask? am I thinking about this right? Have I got the right terms formulated? All of those things.
And it seems they started by saying this wasn't, which it wasn't this like new how to live a happy life thing that we see in our culture.
It's not
like how do you wake up emotionally like happy in the morning or that sort of thing. And that isn't the question that we're asking.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think he's saying like, look, we're asking a bigger question. Maybe the answer is that sort of subjective sense of fulfillment that we associate with the word happiness.
Yeah, subjective well-being.
But I think he's partly what he's pointing to is like, hey, people who have thought about this, when they talk about happiness, like when Aristotle talks about happiness, what we translate as happiness.
Yeah. Was that eudaimonia?
Yeah, eudaimonia, right. He's not talking necessarily about this thing you think of when we think about happiness if you're following kind of our basic conversation in our culture
Which is
now.
what they said was emotional reports about how happy, content, or satisfied one feels right now.
This sort of subjective, I'm happy, I'm not. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I think but it's still good to phrase in terms of happiness, I think, for a number of reasons, because especially here, because I think both traditions use this term happy, being happy.
Yeah.
Both to get at what they're trying to figure out and to undermine the sense that our immediate answer, I don't think it's just modern Western people who think our immediate answer is that subjective sense of well-being. I think people around the world for generations, have been happy in that way, that kind of emotional happiness, right? And that sense of fulfillment, that sense of accomplishment, whatever it is that's that like, I feel good, right? Pleasure, right? That internal sense of pleasure is something that has always had to be part of the conversation to some extent, right? And I say that partly because I remember when I was a graduate student and I was interested in understanding Buddhism more. I was studying it academically. But, as a good scholar of religion, you learn early, you got to go out into the field and see people doing this stuff, right? You can't just read books and think you understand it. So I would go to a lot of different types of Buddhist teachers around Philadelphia at the time who were doing Dharma talks and whatnot.
Yeah.
Maybe partly it's that they were speaking to primarily a middle-class white American audience, right, in those venues. But they did tend to start off with what is Buddhism about? It's about achieving happiness, right? And then let's talk about what happiness is and make that more complex.
I think that's something you and I share. I, at a certain point, did the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which is John Kabat-Zinn's kind of like meditation for well-being. And after that, I didn't do it for academic purposes, but I found myself going to the Austin Zen Center, and then Appamada, and then Mariposa Sangha, and then the Thich Nhat Hanh one called the Plum Blossom Sangha. And I found myself really taking a real survey of Austin contemplative practice communities, and the only thing that kind of stopped that was COVID.
Right.
I did that up until COVID, and then I haven't found my way back to them, but I learned a lot from a lot of Dharma talks. And
I mean, part of why I'm interested in this book is because I do think, the Buddhist tradition is this amazing, coherent, right? It is in many ways less fragmented than the Western tradition in terms of its ancient roots. I mean, it's got its own sort of political ups and downs that, we've lost far more ancient Buddhist texts than we have still, right? Yeah. In the same way, we've lost more ancient Greek texts and even ancient Christian texts than we have now. But it is this tradition that at a very early point takes reasoned discourse, thinking through the problems you're trying to think through in a structured way, using a form of logic to discern, is this true or not, deductive reasoning, very early to address a whole set of complex problems. And it's done that, I think, more in dialogue with the Mediterranean traditions, what we think of as the Western traditions, than we often acknowledge. Because I think there's more low-level conversations happening just between traders who are walking back and forth, right?
You're talking about in the Western tradition.
Well, between the Western tradition and India, right?
Yeah.
And China and whatnot. And but it's this incredible tradition that has done that. But there's a few key differences in the way it's approached it, right?
Yeah.
At the end of this, if he does give an answer, he basically says, well, you got to meditate. Right? Because isn't that, I don't know if you got to that part.
The Buddhism part?
Yeah. But at the end, he's kind of like, well, this is how Buddhists approach it. And Buddhism is awesome because it creates this space for contemplative practice as a vital ingredient in moral life, which is
that would make sense.
Not there in the Western, like at least in the three traditions he's identifying. You don't find a sense of that, at least as it's discussed today, right? So I think, if he's got an answer, I think that's it. Yeah. Meditate. That like part of it is you got to meditate, and that's what the Buddhists teach us. Yeah. I think there's more. He does more than that.
Experience as your teacher, kind of. There was that part. Like, there's a couple different things.
Right.
But I think meditation is probably going to be one of them.
Yeah.
For this chapter, we're talking from the Western part. Socrates, Aristotle.
Yeah, that's who he's really.
Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Mill.
Right.
Which is the three people we really explore from the Western side. And from the Eastern side, it's Buddha's on all of them. But he talks about how Confucius also has opinions on this, and Lao Tzu, who did the Tao Te Ching, also has opinions. But we really focus on Buddhism.
Yeah, and he basically tries to organize it. And it's interesting because we do this partly because we're not as familiar with the Buddhist tradition, is we tend to talk about Western philosophy like it's these individual thinkers who produce things. Yeah. And then when we get to, say, Indian philosophy, we're like, well, there's this school, and it's kind of a little crazy, right? Because it'd be like as if we never talked about Marcus Aurelius and just talked about Stoicism, right? We just, and it's a habit of mind that says they're a culture, we're a bunch of individuals working things out.
Right? Because we're immersed in this one.
And I think it's partly just that. It's a tradition that is so deeply wed to our political traditions, our intellectual traditions, that we have these points of reference.
Yeah.
I think that people who are trying to introduce us to Buddhist thought or any other tradition could do a better job of helping us understand the individuals who contributed, right? Because there are definitely particular voices that these come out of.
Yeah. Now we miss those.
Right. We miss those. Yeah. And it's interesting because when he's talking about Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, right? He's talking about three traditions of ethics, right?
Right. The virtue theory, deontological theory, and then just consequentialist
or utilitarianism. Yeah, we can use both.
Just in speaking of this chapter in general, I had this sense that it had a lot of fluff in it, and I'll explain that really quick because I thought, here, we're exploring this question.
Right.
We're exploring this question, which I've already stated. It's like how to live a morally appropriate human life, how to live a good human life, which I said multiple times. And then we kick it off with Western philosophy started with pre-Socratic people like Homer and Hesiod, and they believed in supernatural causes. And then after that, we got to the pre-Socratic people, and they believe in natural causes like water. And then we got to, the sophists, and they believed in, what does any of this have to do
with this question?
I feel like, are you teaching? Why do I need to know all of this? And is this just to fluff up and just have more information? Because I felt like we could have just dealt with the question: who he was going to use to talk about the question, so I could just focus my energies, because I felt like I've got a limited amount of RAM to bring to this discussion. Why are you filling it with a history of Western philosophy that takes us up to Socrates?
Right.
And then we start past Socrates at Aristotle, which,
Right.
I mean, I think Aristotle and Socrates are real similar, as Aristotle was a student of Plato, right?
Yeah.
I'm even in for that. I'm like digging towards these facts or something, maybe to impress you, or maybe just to impress myself, that I can like hold these things. But why isn't any of this stuff important?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like, we could think about that in two ways, I think. We could say, I guess it's how are we asking this question? Are we asking this in the like rhetorical, why is this important? Can we just get past this? Or are we asking this in the earnest, like, why is this important?
Yeah. Well, I'm asking it. Well, part of it comes to me from a place of maybe frustration.
Right.
You might sense that in my voice. Like, why are you pointing my attention towards this? How is this important to this question? And I would remove the emotion of it and say, is this important to the question that we're asking? And I guess priming me to think about it through the narratives and the theories that you're going to present immediately after. Does this in any way, shape, or form help me to be a better thinker or a better digester of knowledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think so. I mean, I think the historical context of questions and ideas are absolutely vital, right? The question is, this is a book that, like, as you read the introduction, you can see who are they thinking of as their audience.
But are they going to do this for every question?
Yeah. Well, let me finish my thought here.
Okay.
Yeah. And they're kind of like, they're talking about the book primarily like, hey, we're writing this book so that if I'm teaching an introduction to philosophy class and I want to make sure that it's not just an intro to Western philosophy, this might be a good book to have students read, right? And so there's a certain level of like academic work I think they're trying to do, right? That would be part of a class. Like,
okay.
So I think that's part of what's shaping this, is that.
So this sets up the whole rest of the book.
Right. But that's maybe. I mean, like, who. Because when we get a book like this, it seems like a coherent whole, but really what happened is this editor solicited 8 manuscripts and then tried to put them together and figure out which one should come when. Yeah, and I think maybe, I don't know if they're going to do this every time, but I think maybe part of why the editor may have chosen to put this one first is for that reason.
To teach us.
Like, here's some of the basic outline of these two big traditions, right?
Yeah.
And I think that still doesn't answer your question. Because whether it's in the book or in an intro to philosophy class, why is it important to know all these details?
In order to consider how Western thought and Buddhist thought answered this one primary question.
So if you were going to just accept that it's important, what would your answer be? Why would that be important?
Oh, man. Why would it be important? I'm gonna have to put down a little bit of my frustration first, in order, which I don't want to do. Okay, putting down. I'm gonna take this out of here. I'm gonna put this down here. I think he does the same thing for Buddhism, although I think he did a different way, or maybe not as thoroughly. When I think about the way he went through the pre-Vedic, the Vedic, and the post-Vedic, it seemed like it wasn't. It was kind of like, oh, this was just like Homer and Hesiod. He just kind of like, how is that important? I mean, what I took away from it was that they had this question that they started out with was, how do we make sense of the world and our place in it? And that at a certain point they were like, hey, we're not going to figure that out. Let's ask different questions. And maybe that gets us to the first question of well, Socrates got us to this place of conceptual clarification, drawing distinctions and providing justification and all of that, and took us away from this kind of big, broad, how do we make a sense of all of this, which it seemed like they said they weren't going to answer anymore or try to answer anymore.
At least this guy is not going to in this essay.
Yeah. Well, he said that the sophists did that. They said the sophists looked at all the other pre-Socratic thinkers that couldn't agree on anything.
Right.
other than Thales, I don't know how to pronounce that, Thales, and said, well, let's just change the question to how to live a successful life.
Right.
But you think folks are trying to still answer this question of how do we make sense of the world and our place in it?
They still are, absolutely. And that's a big part of philosophy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we'll get that because, the next question is what is knowledge? So that's going to be, how do we make sense of it?
Which I'm just going to go on with one of the words that I looked up. Is that epistemology? Epistemology.
Yeah.
Is basically like, what do we know? And we're not going to jump to the second chapter. I haven't read any of it yet. So we can't jump to it, but okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this first question, now I'll put on a little bit of a lecturer hat and say, okay, so, there's a lot of different ways we organize philosophy, but the three big topics tend to be metaphysics, epistemology, yeah.
and ethics. And we approach this one. This question,
is ethics.
Totally. But could we approach this question from the other two perspectives, or is he choosing to only approach it from ethics? That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think he's just approaching it from ethics, and because they're driven by those questions, right? To some extent, you could say, if I'm trying to say, how do I live a good life?
Yeah.
You would have to say, well, I have to know things to do that.
Which is epistemology.
Right.
Let's work on that
epistemology.
Word. Epistemology.
Yeah.
Just one more time.
Epistemology. Right. Which just comes from the word episteme, which is a Greek word for knowledge.
Epistemology.
Right. So we could just call it knowledgeology.
Epistemology. Okay. Epistemology. So, okay. Continue.
Yeah. So, we're going to have to, no branch is isolated from the others, right? And, in one of the larger arguments that tends to follow in my intro to philosophy class, which is going to be a much bigger discussion, right? Because it happens over 16 weeks.
Yeah.
Is going to be the interrelatedness of these. And then when I teach ethics, and that these aren't like these questions, how do I know something, right?
Right. Epistemology.
What is real? Metaphysics.
Well, that's metaphysical.
And what should I do?
Ethics.
Right? That these questions are interrelated with each other. And when I teach ethics, part of what I really try to show them is that, there's a way in which once you understand the epistemology and metaphysics of the thinkers that we're looking at, whether that's Aristotle or Mill or Kant or the Buddha, you can begin to predict to some extent the kinds of answers they're going to give you about how you sort through moral problems, right?
Quick question. Does the Buddha fall into these three main divisions as well? Does Eastern philosophy fall into these three?
So this is an interesting thing about the fact that he uses those three. I mean, and part of it is like if you take an ethics class, usually if you look at like the learning outcomes that the state provides, that says this is what people are supposed to learn in an ethics class. Typically, there's a commitment to these three normative theories, right? Virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialism, or utilitarian. That those are the three things that students should have to learn about and figure out how to work with. They are the types of ethics that govern things like ethics boards at hospitals.
So these three that he brings up here, the three dominant Western views, they're three dominant Western views for ethics, not just for how people looking at this question.
Right. But I mean, I think he thinks that this question is the ethical question. The ethical question is, how do I lead a good life?
The big ethical question.
Right. That is what drives us. Because like anything we try to do, we gotta like, why are we trying to think through this? It's because we have a question. That's not the question I begin with in ethics. I mean, I think thinking about ethics in terms of a good life is very productive to addressing the question. But for me, the fundamental question is, what should I do? Right?
Yeah.
And like I say to my students, it's like the reason we do ethical reasoning or go to some other source of ethical advice is because we're confronted with that question at some point
What
in our
should
life.
I do?
What should I do? And there's a lot of times the what should I do is linked to something particularly practical, right? What should I do to make this casserole? Well, I should start off by sauteing the onions, right? That's a very practical thing.
Right.
And so those aren't quite the ethical question, right? They're more like little practical questions that we need to answer for the ethical question. But the ethical question is like any of those moments when you're like, what should I do? And it's not really a practical question, right? When you're like, get up in the morning, right? What should I do? Should I go to work or not? Should I,
Yeah.
And there's all these.
What kind of job? What is my purpose?
Right. And I think that leads to a whole, when done right, when you're really working through that, it does lead to sort of this in-depth examination that is more fundamentally, what should I do with this life that I have? I think sometimes that can explode it too big. Because I think when a lot of people are thinking that, they're like, no, should I go to work today?
Right? well, really, I think
should I be mean to my mom?
When they break
should I
this
be
down,
nice?
they are breaking it down to the human person. And I think we're starting with the Western stuff, and then we'll talk about Buddhism, and then we'll talk about comparative.
Right.
And so kicking it off with this, they start with ethical, and it goes in either the human person,
right,
the human action,
right,
or consequences. So they're automatically like setting it up as one event, right? One thing.
Right.
Like I need to, like maybe I've got I don't know, what's a good example of something? Some kind of, should I feed this homeless man?
Right. Good question.
Should I feed this homeless man? And then so they look at it through virtue theories, which was Aristotle, and that's dealing with the human person.
Right.
Like make the person should be good, and then good people make, and you know what? Good is an interesting word to use there because we're talking about ethics, and in here a lot they talk about morals. They talk about, what is the moral decision? Mm-hmm. And moral's not synonymous with good.
Yeah, I mean,
is it?
I think we try to distinguish that because we don't like the word moral, but we're talking about moral philosophy. Ethics is just moral philosophy.
Ethics is moral philosophy. So how is moral different from good? The word good is moral. I mean, moral means like some kind of.
Yeah, it means. Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what do we mean by good?
When I think of the word moral, why do I think of like religion? Like religion's telling me to do something.
Right, because that's how we think about it in our culture. And, we're all like still 10-year-olds who are like, no, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so to get to a conversation that's just not that, we're like, all right, let's just get rid of this moral word and let's talk about ethics.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to worry. Because, I mean, if we think about ethics as moral philosophy, at that point, we're not trying to say you should do this or you should not do this. But how should we think about what you should do or not do, right? How should we think about what I should do or not do?
Yeah.
And so if we're caught up in that kind of either I'm looking for someone to give me the answers and I'll just do the things I'm told, or screw you, I'm not going to do what you tell me, like one or the other, right?
Well, the idea here,
neither of them are helpful for the intellectual work of sorting through what is the source of goodness, right? What is the source of normativity? What is the source of making that decision?
Well, if I'm
how do I make that decision?
Someone else had to come to a conclusion of what to do. And I think in here he talks about, how do you create a person that comes to the conclusion themselves, exposes themselves to the experiences they need to, or the education or the intellectual thought that they need to make those decisions,
right? And
without asking anybody else what they should or shouldn't do.
Yeah, I mean, or you might ask them, but you don't take their answer as a warrant in itself. You're not an authority who gets to tell me what to do
because they have agency. What did they say? They said humans realize their appropriate end. What is that? No, that might rational agency.
Right.
They're a rational agent.
Right.
What
does that mean?
That they have autonomy? Is that like I have control over my life? I have self-determination. I have the ability to control outcomes by my actions? Is that what that means?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like when you go back to it, you go back to that question, like, what should I do? If you stop at that moment, and say, well, what is in this question? What gives me even the capability to ask this question? If this question is meaningful, one, I have this question because I have an ability to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I have an ability to make choices. That's agency.
Right. Agency.
Two, how can I figure this out? I can think through it. I have rationality, right? And if I believe that I can think through it and that somehow organizing the thoughts in a way will lead to true thoughts, which is what we believe about deductive reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Organizing in a certain way will lead to true thoughts.
These are like, if I have certain premises, if I have certain true thoughts, true ideas, and I put them together in the right way, they can lead me to conclusions, other ideas that I then know are true because of the formal structure of the way I'm thinking through it. And that's my rationality. So there's an interesting thing where then, in the Western tradition, the emergence of rationalist ethics, right, which is the types of ethics they're talking about. What's interesting is he leaves out two other major forms of ethics.
Is that part of all three of these?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Rational ethics is a part of all three of these.
Yeah. And so
when I say all three of these, I mean the human person, the human action, and the consequences, which is the virtue theories, deontological theories, and the consequentialists or utilitarians.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think all three of those are really helpful for thinking through questions of what I should do.
All three of them.
Right.
It's not like you choose one.
What I dislike about this,
choose one.
Right. What I dislike about his presentation is he presents them as if they're these competing normative theories.
That's what I thought.
And a lot of intro to ethics textbooks do that, and it's nonsense, right? Like none of them have been able to establish them as themselves as total theories.
Well, it does seem like the authors thought, like Kant was like, no, Aristotle was wrong, this is how it is.
Yeah, but
and Mill was like, no, I think both of them are wrong, this is how it is.
Right, and I think that's wrong. Like,
you're like, all three of them are wrong.
No, I mean,
actually all three of them.
No, I think when I read Kant, I don't think Kant is saying Aristotle is junk.
Right.
I think he has a very particular question he's trying to answer, which is what makes an action moral. And, it's partly that they have very different questions that they're trying to answer about how we make good moral decisions. Aristotle basically says, like, look, we have to think through this, but most decisions you're not making because you're thinking through it. Most of you go throughout the day, you're not being nice to your mom because every time you see her, you're like, I should be nice to my mom.
It's not about the action. For him, it's about everything you've done up until then and whether or not you're a good kid that loves his mom because of all the things that happened up until that question of you're asking, and you're not actually doing, it's not a human. You're not thinking about the consequences. You're not thinking about that action. But if you are a mom-loving person, you're going to say, hey, Mom, I love you.
But that's not what he's saying, right? I think that's exactly
that's a virtue theory.
That's what you get a virtue theory from reading this little summary of it. But that's not what Aristotle's saying. He's saying, obviously, thinking about the consequences of your actions, that's a good virtue. You should do that, right? When you have the moment to do that, right?
Yeah.
But more often what happens is you have these spaces where you can think through things. So use your reason, figure it out, and then train yourself to be a good person by acquiring certain types of habits.
Ooh, this is a word I want to share that I looked up. Inculcation.
Right.
Inculcation, or the instilling of knowledge or values in someone, usually by repetition. That's what you're talking about there.
Right. Or habituation.
Right. I depends on that word.
Yeah. I mean, well, and it's interesting because virtue ethics basically has an influence on two major ways we approach things. One is self-cultivation. Which, if you're following some self-help program or engaging in any kind of like yoga beyond just physical yoga, you're engaging in some form of self-cultivation.
Yeah.
And so you're engaging in some sort of virtue ethical practice.
This is self-help. This is anything that you would constitute like personal or professional development. Right.
And the other side is education, and particularly character education, right? So really what he's trying to do is like, how do we figure out what are the things we should cultivate in ourselves? Courage, humility. What are the things we should, when we educate our children, or even educating adults, but they're often thinking in the ancient world about education of children. We should teach each other to do. Courage, humility, etc. And then how do we go about doing that?
Yeah.
That doesn't say you're not thinking about consequences when you're thinking about whether you're going to do something
Well,
right
they're
or not.
thinking this will get us the consequences we want.
Right. Well, and that, like, yeah.
But they are thinking about consequences.
Consideration of the consequences of your action, that's a good way. So instead of focusing on the calculus of how I do that, he's focusing on that particular question. Now, on the flip side, if we go to Mill, I mean, they all do think which one is primary, right? That's that, like, so it's more like the real work is making yourself a good person for Aristotle. The real work for Mill is figuring out how to do that assessment, right? He basically assumes he's talking to people who want to do good in the world, right? Like, he's not. There's a level at which I think for utilitarian ethics, I can't convince you whether you should be good or not, right? I should just begin there. I think a really good example of this is Peter Singer's drowning child argument, right? Because in the article where he presents that, he basically starts off and he says, I'm going to assume for this that you are the type of person who believes that if you're walking by a pond and you see a child drowning in the pond, your job is to jump in and save
that child.
Right?
Yeah.
Assuming you have the capability to do that.
Yeah.
Right? That you know how to swim.
You're not in a wheelchair, that you know how to swim.
And even if you're wearing your best Armani suit.
Right, you're going to jump in there with that suit on.
You jump in there and get that child.
Absolutely.
Right. And if you don't believe that,
then we're not in the same discussion.
Right, we're not in the same discussion.
You can't even be in this room with me. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's the covered charge for this club.
Yeah, and I think when we think about moral philosophy, a lot of times we get hung up on that, like, should we say? And I think most of us aren't there, right?
Yeah.
And it's an interesting game to play, like, well, do I have an obligation to save the drowning?
I wouldn't think about any of that.
Right, like, it's not...
You're not going to run through this chapter before you save this child.
That's not what most people want out of moral philosophy, right? And so, at least that's not a good place to begin.
It's a low-hanging fruit. I don't need help with that one.
Right, exactly. I mean, Singer's argument is interesting because he makes a very compelling argument in that article. I've never seen anyone get around it except to fundamentally really think how we think about ethics, which is, if you believe that's true, then you should be living in next to poverty. You should be working hard, making as much money as you can, and living next to poverty on those wages and giving all your money away to combat world hunger. Right?
Dang.
And if you're not doing that, you're failing morally.
It's a long... Okay, I don't know how we got there. That's like another...
I mean, and he's thinking about it as a consequentialist, like Mill. He's like, basically, like, what are the consequences of your actions, and what is your fundamental moral duty? And he basically says, look, we're in a world where, one, you are aware of the suffering of others. You're aware of the suffering in the kids in Gaza. You're aware of the suffering of all these people around the world.
Yeah, your awareness.
And two, we actually have the capability to
help. We could do something to impact that.
And what most people who are trying to work on doing that need is your money. So you should give them your money. Right?
I have this thing I've thought about in my life and about this.
Right.
And I want to talk to you about it now. And I have a little bit of fear because I don't know that it's a great thing that I've thought. And so you'd be like, oh, juicy, that's good. And I'm scared to talk about it, even feel a little bit emotional. So there's this idea that folks live somewhere where there's not enough food for them to eat. Like a certain population has grown to where the resources of the land that they're on won't sustain that population of human beings. Mm-hmm. And so now human beings in other parts of the world go, hey, these people are living in a place where the land doesn't provide enough resources for them to survive. We need to send resources there to enhance what the land is not providing in order for them all to live. There's this idea I have of like, wait, the land is kind of dictating population growth in a way that's really healthy. Like it's hard to talk about deer and human beings in the same breath. And I'm going to.
Right.
Like, if we saw a population of deer grow in a certain region where there wasn't enough food to sustain those deer, you would start to see starvation and other things as a result, and that would control the population size of that animal. And now, I feel horrible. Now apply that to another group of humans that have grown to a population size that the land they're on won't sustain it. And now what we do is we're like, we can impact change there. We can send money to people that can send rice to a place and then forever tie these people to external resources in order to survive, thereby making them the ultimate, servants. They have they're what's the word when you codependent,
right?
Or just dependent.
Yeah,
not even
if you're
just fully dependent on these food,
right?
When I was growing up, it's like you could send a nickel a month and we could feed all these people.
Right.
And I'm like, well, should we feed them? They should leave those places and go to places where the land is providing more food. Not like, let's send stuff to this place that doesn't provide enough food and leave them there. And so this is where I think consequentialism for me is like, how do we understand the consequences of our actions?
That's exactly what he's saying.
Down the road.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Wait, you just said that. I don't understand what you mean when you say that's exactly what he's saying.
That's exactly what Mill is saying in utilitarianism and in consequentialism is like, think through the actual consequences of what you're doing and the amount of good that comes from that action. And so you could take an action that morally seems good.
Yeah, it's like a bunch of famous people get to take up this charge and this this flag of I'm saving human beings, and they get to be seen as, but what they're actually doing is making a whole group of human beings.
And even if we take that out, even if we take out the kind of they're just doing it for maybe they have genuine moral motivation,
and they just
and we have that all the time in our lives. We have things that seem like the good thing to do, and we seem like we have good reasons to do it. But I think when we listen to consequentialist thinkers and what they have to tell us, it is a good thing. But is the result of your action going to actually produce a good result for the people you're trying to help?
Yeah.
And is that result, maybe there's a good immediate result, but is there a good, and it's as simple as you have a child. You want your child to be happy. Mm-hmm. They're asking you for a sugary dessert. In the most immediate sense, the best way to make them hot is to give them the sugary dessert.
Can't give them the sugary dessert.
So you have to consider sort of what's going downstream.
Maybe even consider not only these people, but the land that they're living on. They're going to grow the population size more because we're sending them all this food, and now the land is actually going to suffer. So it's like seeing in this holistic way of not only the people, but the land and the people and the land, and then maybe the animals and the plants that live on that land. And
this is an important question for consequentialist thinkers. Who counts? Is it human beings?
Is it just human beings, or is it
Mother
Singer, Earth, Gaia?
Singer, who I was mentioning earlier with that, he's one of the first philosophers who really develops kind of philosophical ethics around animal rights in a book called Animal Liberation, where he makes an argument that we've basically failed. His standard is he's a utilitarian, which is a consequentialist who specifically looks at pleasure, thought large, right? Mm-hmm. Mental pleasure, happiness, pleasure as the source of goodness because you can say we want to produce good, but how do we tell what's good? You have to have a value theory, right? You have to have a theory of what is good. Classically, Mill, before him, Bentham, who developed utilitarianism, utilitarian thinkers like Singer, they look to pleasure, they look to happiness, they look to that as the judge of what is good, right? And so what Singer basically argues, I'm oversimplifying this, right?
Yeah.
But he basically argues that, look, we know animals experience pleasure and pain. Therefore, we have to give them moral consideration, right?
Well, how do you apply that then to your gardener?
Right.
how do you apply that to plants? When a plant thrives, you got to think, oh, this thriving plant doesn't have brown edges.
Right. Is there like levels of sentience that count or don't? Yeah, those are important questions to figure out, right?
Where do we draw the line? Is it humans and then animals? Is it humans, animals, and then plants? And like what is thriving? What
I think those
happiness
are
and
interesting recreational questions to ask that have some impact on what we do. But I also think those become the kind of, it's almost like a Soviet whataboutism, right? It's a way to like stop actually taking action and doing the right thing and making a decision by going into all the different things or possibilities or whatnot.
And whataboutism, for a second, just for me and for anybody who doesn't know what whataboutism is, it'd be like, I would say to you, we really need to make coffee right now. And you'd be like, well, what about drinking tea? And I would be like, well, what about, having water? That's probably the best for us. And you'd be like, well, what about,
Yeah, and it's whatever province it has. It was identified by intelligence consultants like the Rand Corporation and whatnot as a key technique of the KGB. In information warfare.
What?
Yeah, I mean, that's where it comes from.
Whataboutism comes from...
Is to say, like, when I question the morality of your action, right?
Yeah.
Or you it's more sort of like when I come forward with something, they say, we should do this, or you shouldn't do that, or you're bad for doing this.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, what about... So if
what about these other people doing that?
If I say, well, you really shouldn't kill the animals, you're like, well, what about the plants?
Yeah. I see.
Or what about this time when you did that, right?
It's somehow deflecting
it's a
the
way,
question and not having a discussion.
The Rand Corporation describes it as a fire hose. I can't remember it, but it's sort of like
that.
This fire hose of disruption of your ability to even think through things.
And so we can't have a discussion because someone constantly deflects down to something different.
And the thing is, those are intellectually interesting questions to ask.
But we got to stump somewhere and have a discussion.
Right. So
you can't say, what about?
Right. We can't bring that up in our practical decision making. I mean, and again, it's good, smart people. When I was chair of philosophy, my first year, I was like, how do I work with these people? And it was all the other philosophers, because I'm trying to decide whether we're going to get us to decide whether we're going to have a talk on a Wednesday or a Thursday, and they want to examine like the nature of Wednesdayness versus Thursdayness as a principle of making and we just need to make a decision, go on and get to the next item on the agenda.
Not philosophy right now, guys.
Like we're just trying to build a calendar.
Okay?
Right.
What is Wednesday anyway, man?
Exactly. And it wasn't
What about Sundays?
It wasn't exactly like that, but it was kind of like, well, Wednesdays students tend to have this, and Thursdays, and just like, yeah, we can speculate all day long, and I think that's good to do, right? But there's also a level at which, we make the decision.
Yeah. Okay. So back to, we've talked a little bit about the virtue theory and then consequentialists, which was Aristotle on the virtue theory. And then that's just all the virtues, like create a virtuous person, right? And then consequentialist is like, what is the impact of the action? And we choose the action that has the most positive, or you said the most pleasurable impact.
Right. Like we have to figure out what we value first, right? Yeah. Classic utilitarianism says pleasure.
Okay.
Right. Again, don't think of it just as physical pleasure, but mental pleasure, happiness, etc., contentment, like all those things.
It's not hedonism.
It is. It's altruistic hedonism. Okay. So it's hedonism that is not about producing the most pleasure in yourself, but for all of us.
Yes.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
It's selfless.
Right.
Yeah.
And then deontological.
And then the one in the middle that we haven't really discussed a lot is the deontological theory, which is Kant.
Right.
And it first went into this. I didn't really understand this a lot. He kind of describes Kant trying to do for moral philosophy what Newton did for physics.
Exactly.
And he did a pretty cool quote. He said, 2 things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Mm-hmm. And I mean, how do you how do you do that for philosophy? How do you specify the laws of matter and motion within philosophy?
Yeah, I mean that's what he aims to do and believes he accomplished in his moral system. And there are Kantians who are like, if you understand what he's up to, you would agree it. Like the reason you don't agree with him is because you don't
understand it.
Right. Which is like everything. Like it's the same with calculus. Like, like the reason I don't think this works if I don't think this works is I don't understand
it.
Right. And so he's engaging in I think a different project than these other folks.
And within the three, there's the human person, virtue. There's consequentialist, which is the outcome, and he sits in the middle of the human action.
Right. And so part of why we call it deontological ethics is because it's rule-based ethics, right? And so it's an idea that, like, if we're doing something moral, we're doing it because that thing is good to do, right? And what makes it good, he will argue, is that it follows a rule. It follows a norm. And this is an interesting argument. See if you can follow me with this, because he is hard. I mean, Kant is that philosopher that, like, philosophers like are like, I understand Kant. I'm a real philosopher, right? And there are like definitely philosophers out there who don't want to talk about Kant because they don't want to look stupid because he's so hard to wrap his head around.
Oh my God!
So he's a very difficult and nuanced thinker, and it has been. I am mostly humbled by Kant. Like, I think when I read Kant, I am not sure if he's the most brilliant philosopher in the tradition, or if he's a madman. He's probably one or the other.
He's either the most brilliant or he's a madman.
Right. I think he's, because, and increasingly, like, there's things I've gone back to and I come back and I'm like, whoa, I think he's right. So anyway, the argument, it goes something like this. He says, well, what makes an action moral? What makes an action moral is that my motivation to do it is pure.
Yeah, not from self-interest or passion, but out of respect for moral law.
Right.
Human reason generating categorical imperatives or rules of action that prescind from self-interest.
Right. And so it's like, look, if I'm trying to do this because I want to produce a good for you, that's not what makes it moral.
Right.
What makes it moral is that, like, I might have a law that I'm supposed to do good for you, and I'm following that law that I'm supposed to do good for you. So there's a level at which he's really trying to drill down and says, what is the source of moral law? Part of what he's trying to do is to do that within reason alone, right? He has this commitment that we can use reason to get there.
This is the categorical imperative that he's talking about.
And he'll ultimately arrive at the categorical imperative, right? Which is its own kind of confusing thing because there's three formulations.
Oh my God.
that sound very different from each other. But its first formulation is usually something along the lines of, if I'm going to do something, it should be something I'm doing because I'm following a moral law that would be equally applicable in any case like this, right? And that universality of the law itself is what establishes its truth, right? And so if I think through things and I realize that there's some reason to do this, some law, some principle I'm following that would be universally applicable in any case, then that is what gives it its moral law. That is the highest standard of the moral law.
That it's universally accepted.
Right. And so it gets a little easier to understand if you think about some of his examples. He says, for example, if I am lending or I'm borrowing money from you, right, with no intent to pay it back.
That's not borrowing.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly the point.
You used the wrong word.
Right. Right. Exactly. And that's why.
Change that word to taking money from me.
Exactly.
And then we're good.
Right. And so the fact that I would borrow money from you without
you have to pay it back.
I have violated the basic principle that allows
Our
the
contract,
act of borrowing to take place.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so that's what establishes its normativity, its moral weight, is its universality.
Yeah, universally, if someone says...
But
sometimes people say they're going to borrow something and they never intend to pay it back. Like things like, can you lend me, can you lend me a piece of paper?
Right.
I'm lending them that piece of paper. I'm never getting it back.
Right.
It's a piece of paper. I rip it out of here.
Right.
I give it to them. They write on it. It's over.
Yeah, and that's probably just a failure of our language to correspond to what we're actually saying.
Yeah.
I think in those cases there's a mutual understanding between us that you're not really lending.
I'll sometimes bring it up.
We're just using the term lend to be polite.
Yeah.
Right? No, I have that problem too because I tend to be a literalist in the way I speak and think, and so
I'm a literalist. I just found out.
Like I end up being pedantic, right?
I am too.
Right.
So,
and I just try to remind myself that that's not the case.
But with money, and if it's over the amount you would use to get a soda,
right?
Borrow means a certain thing.
Mm-hmm.
It means that at some point I'm going to get this back.
Right. So yeah, that's the basics of it, and that if you think through things, you can establish a set of rules, right? Now, I mean, he ultimately is like, hey, these rules look like the basic moral teachings of the Christian tradition. That's a warrant that they're true, right? For him, that's like that. There's an alignment between reason and faith.
So some kind of pattern,
right?
Historic pattern
is an even greater, like sort of like
he was Christian?
He was a pietist Christian. So I think not
pietist. What does pietist means? He was a devout.
Yeah, I mean it's a type of
pious or
pietist? Well, it's a tradition of Christianity in Germany. It's part of what lays the groundwork for like evangelical Christianity.
Okay.
So it is a form of Christianity that focuses very much on the inner journey of the person of faith around a life of faith, right? So he was very concerned with that, but he also wanted to figure out ways, as he saw happening in the sciences, to know and understand the world through reason and observation. And here, really reason, that didn't have to rely on a particular tradition's ideas about the nature of revelation and whatnot. So,
okay. So that's we've gone through all the Western ones.
All the Western ones he talks about.
Right. In the book. Human person, virtue theories, human action, deontological theories, and then consequentialists. And this is where my notes cease. Like we end my notes, and then we start talking about Buddhism.
Buddhism, right.
Right. Which is where we kind of like, we had the pre-Vedic, the Vedic, and then the post-Vedic, which it seems like the pre-Vedic was supernatural. The Vedic was... Do you remember? Was the Vedic? The Vedic is where we started getting reincarnation, and because they saw the life death cycle, and they seemed to see like similarities in the children to how they look to their parents. So they thought like, that means that we're coming back.
I didn't like either of his two narratives about the history of
Egypt. It seems like he was pointing to their ideas of reincarnation being kind of like primitive or like
he basically, I'm too much of a historian.
Yeah.
So you were frustrated with that because he's going through this, and I was frustrated because like your history is really simplistic.
It's inaccurate. He wasn't. He wasn't drawn upon enough.
Right, and has some sort of he basically has this idea that I think, there's some level of this. It's speculative that probably how people get to moral thought is, and we see it in these traditions, is people initially have religious ideas, right? We should do things because the people in charge say, the gods, things should be this way or that way.
Sky daddies.
Right. I don't actually think that's how the ancient Greeks, when you read Homer and Hesiod, that's not what I get. And I've read the Odyssey like 8 times.
You don't get the supernatural.
Yeah, there's not this sort of supernatural moral law. In fact, if you read the Odyssey, it's much more complex. The whole opening of the Odyssey is just really calling into question the morality of these gods. But they're in charge, right? So you want to, it's their power that's important. But that humans have initially developed some sort of notion that we should do good. Maybe they tell each other stories about that to create a moral community, to function as a community, and they locate that agency in some sort of sky daddy, right?
Yeah.
And then they begin to investigate that and develop theories about how it works, and then eventually get to these more rational theories of morality. Mm-hmm. I think that's the argument he's trying to make in these two traditions, is that ultimately
Buddhism and the Vedics and the...
And I think the takeaway is that both traditions are following their own trajectory around this. And in that, in their different historical experiences, arriving on different points of emphasis and different ways of looking at this. Mm-hmm. Because I think ultimately what he's trying to say is, if there's an argument for this chapter, is it would be really good to put Buddhism and Western philosophers into conversation about this question.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's all he's, I think, trying to argue at the end of the day.
That they should talk together.
They should talk to each other, and it would be really valuable to do so.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
When I think about what they shared during this and think this is, how do we talk about this chapter as much as we talked about the Western chapter? I didn't write any notes about it, but when I think about them side by side, I think consequentialist maps to me about discussions of karma. Mm-hmm. That, like, the idea that if I live a good life, if I live what in the Western tradition would be a morally accurate or a morally whatever life, I'm going to come back the next life as someone that's better or a better animal. I don't know how that works exactly, but I'm gonna go up the level. I'm gonna level up, and then in my every action sense, there's a karmic consequence to every individual action that both of these seems to point to the consequentialists.
Yeah. Although I think in that presentation, it's an egoistic consequentialism, right? Because it's no longer what produces the most good.
I just consider myself.
I'm considering myself, but I consider myself then as a self that goes through a series of incarnations, right? Which, in Buddhist teachings, I think it's interesting because that's there, right? That's there, but that's almost like this weird Jedi mind trick if you think about it. Because as you start thinking about that, you start thinking about reincarnating in an infinity of potential universes and whatnot, you realize that everybody who exists at some point was in a relationship with you. So you have these kinds of obligations. So in like Mahayana Buddhism, mm-hmm. there's this teaching, sort of a meditational teaching, which is, to cultivate compassion whenever you encounter someone.
Think of them as your mom.
Think of them as your mom.
Yeah, I've heard of this.
Right? And that's rooted in this notion of reincarnation, because at some point in an infinity of universes,
they are your mom.
They were your mom, or they will be, right? Or, yeah. So there is a fundamental, and I think the problem with this is that we live in like what for Buddhist teachers teaching in our culture is we live in a culture where fundamental appreciation for your mom for giving you life is not part of our. We're more hung up on how my mom didn't teach me right?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I'm estranged from my mom,
right?
And, so like, have me think everybody is my mom. I'd be like, oh no, you can't treat me that way. Right. I'm not talking anymore. Exactly. We need to pick someone else.
Exactly. So I think there's things that can be lost in that because it doesn't fit in this. But I think there is a sort of, it is rooted in this notion that like I've been given a life. And if there's anyone responsible for bringing me to life, it's that woman.
Yeah. I should give her more credit for that.
Probably. It'd probably be good.
Yeah.
Everything else, but that's part of what Buddhist teachings are supposed to do, is to lead you in these later teachings of compassion, is to lead you to a recognition of the fundamental obligation you have to give other human beings consideration as other human beings, no matter what they've done to you, right?
Yeah.
Right? And ultimately that's for you and your path enlightenment as it is for them, right? There is something fundamentally selfish, for lack of a better word, in Buddhist philosophy, because it is very focused on how do you get enlightenment.
One person reaching enlightenment.
Right.
It's not like how do we all reach enlightenment.
Right.
It's how does one person. Well, he wanted to take his teachings after the Bodhi tree and all of that and help everyone get to enlightenment. Right? The Buddha did.
That's a good question.
The question is, did he?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah, and I think, and that's part. So part of how he organizes it is between these two different schools of Buddhism.
What were the two?
Well, he presents them as Theravada Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism.
Yeah,
it's not exactly right because Theravada Buddhism. So to start off with, we don't have a form of Buddhism today that are any of the ancient schools of Buddhism before the Mahayana reforms happened. So Mahayana Buddhism are these movements that begin 300 to 400 years after the Buddha, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole new set of ways of looking at that, new teachings, new sutras.
Is where they codify things.
Right. Well, they've codified things before that in the three baskets in the Tripattha.
Yeah, right. They talked about the three baskets.
Which we have because the Theravada Buddhist tradition preserves this. Now, the thing is, the Theravada Buddhism is a revivalist tradition, right? It's a modern tradition that I think it's around the 14th century begins to try to revive one of these ancient schools of Buddhism, right? And so I'm always cautious at thinking of Theravada Buddhism, which means the way of the elders. It's
the way of the elders,
right? As some sort of pure representation of ancient Buddhism. The fact is, we only really have access to ancient Buddhism through texts.
So ancient Buddhism, we're talking about Buddha,
right? Buddha and the first 300 or 400 years,
right? And then 300 or 400 years after he
right. And many of those ancient schools stick around for another 1,000 years or not. So, I mean, the heartland of Buddhism is where?
Is Nepal or Tibet?
Well, it's India.
Is it India?
Yeah, historically.
Okay.
We say Tibet, we say Nepal, because if we go to India today, any Buddhism that's there is primarily from Tibet or Nepal. There's no native Buddhism to India anymore, right?
Because it's Hindu now.
Yeah, I mean, partly
it might be a bunch of different things, but
right. I mean, it's actually the end of Buddhism in India is when the initial Turkic invaders, who are Muslims, come in and destroy the final Indian monasteries.
And so, do they take refuge up in the mountains, which is why it's sustained up there? I don't know.
Oh yeah, I mean I mean, once you get up into the Himalayas, right into Nepal and Tibet, you're away from where the Hindu Rajas and the Islamic sultans and whatnot were not. And it doesn't seem like there was a concerted effort to stamp out Buddhism by that point. Buddhism was in decline in India because it had become probably this very isolated monastic system. And you think if you're like an army of Turks coming across the mountains into the Indus River Valley, and you see these giant forts in the distance, you're like, we got to take that thing. It's only after you finish slaughtering them that you realize that they're a bunch of monks and not a bunch of soldiers, right? Yeah. So that's probably how this played out. It's a good question. Historians like, why does Indian Buddhism go away? But most of the ancient schools are there, right?
I think I need to let Peppermint in. Hey, no, coffee. Don't get that coffee. You're a good pup. But back to
so there's these two traditions,
right.
And
Theravada and Mahayana.
Yeah,
these are some of the words that I didn't know how to pronounce.
Right. So it does seem to be that in ancient Buddhism, there was more focus on this is a system to help you get enlightened, right? And follow this system, and you'll be enlightened like I was.
The ego, the one singular person.
The person, right?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, there's all these like tricky understandings, like the teaching around Anatman, right, of no self, is there in the ancient traditions, and that does begin to break down this notion that what you're working on is some enlightenment of some, right? So, but at some point later, there's more focus on a number of different things. Like one is on the laity, right, on lay people, because there's in classical Buddhism, there's a clear social order that is about monks and nuns working on enlightenment, and lay people following a less rigorous set of precepts about how to live their lives. And their major role is really to support the monasteries, right? there's this interesting notion that like, if you're just Philip, right, you could go become a monk.
Yeah.
But being a monk is tough.
Yeah.
Right? And you could go there and waste their time and your time and get nothing out of it. And most people are in that situation, right? Most people shouldn't be monks or nuns. Right?
Yeah.
They're not going to get enlightened this life, right? So what should they do? They should focus on being a generally good person, getting merit by supporting monks and nuns and their, helping the people who can get enlightened, so that they're more likely to be born again.
As someone who will get enlightened.
Right, and just keep moving up that ladder, right?
So they figured out in their life, I can't be a monk or nun, but I can do something that will get me to being someone who could be a monk or nun.
And so Mahayana thinkers tend to blow up this whole model in a number of ways. And if you listen to Mahayana teachers, like Tibetan Buddhist teachers, they'll often say, they'll emphasize, probably because it was such an emphasis at the time, what we are teaching is a way that any person can get enlightened in this lifetime. Right? Even if you're a layperson.
You don't have to worry about taking this additional step.
Right. Like there's a path for the householder, there's a path for the monk, there's a path for everyone to get there.
Is that because they just wanted more, they wanted more adoption?
I mean, we can, sure. If we believe that people just do things out of these sort of selfish or institution building things, sure. I don't think so. I think they actually thought that was the case.
They thought that's true.
Right.
That you don't actually have to go to a monastery to get there.
Right. They achieved things in meditational states that said, oh, yeah, so I think
they don't have to, you don't have to be in a monastery to do it. You don't have to wear these clothes to do it. You don't have to have a certain haircut to do it. You can do it in the comfort of your home.
Right.
This was the original.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the ideas that comes up. So
this was the original remote working.
Right, exactly.
This is a joke I'm trying to get at, Grant.
You can do this from the comfort of your own life.
This is a remote religion.
You don't have to leave your family behind.
Yeah, you stay in your house.
I mean, just think about
you're going to remote into Buddha.
Right. I mean, did you ever notice that in the original story of the Buddha's a deadbeat dad?
Yeah, well, he was a prince, right? That was kind of
he abandons his wife and kids.
Yeah,
to go
on his thing.
Right, never thinks of them again.
He never thinks of them again.
Nope, he just goes. And
I never thought of that.
Yeah. and
what a jerk! I bet you his kids are like,
right? Where's dad?
They're like, I grew up without a dad.
Right.
That stinked.
Yeah, and
he was busy meeting an old person,
right.
a sick person, and people that hurt themselves for God.
Right, and then being like, oh, this is so awful. I need to abandon everything and go try to find people to study with so I can figure this out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
His kiddos, goodness.
I mean, that's a little impious to say, and I don't want to offend Buddhist listeners too much with that.
Impious meaning it's you're smiting their religion a little bit?
I mean, but I think it's something to contemplate, and later Buddhism definitely develops ways to manage this, right? They're like in the earliest codes about monks and nuns, we do find this sort of like your family has to agree before you're allowed to come.
Yeah.
Right? Join the monastery. So, there's...
What I noticed
there's a moving towards others, I think, in Mahayana Buddhism too.
Yeah.
That's it. And this
that we can include everybody,
right? And
some holistic good.
And there's sort of like, so if we're talking about ourselves, this is where you get at those terms. There's this sort of ideal. The ideal they talk about is the arhat ideal. An arhat is a worthy one. It's someone who has done the work and is gonna
arhat.
They're gonna get out when they die. At least this is their last life. And that shifts to the bodhisattva ideal, which is someone who says...
They're going to wear the robes. They're going to...
No. What they say is, I'm not going to... if I'm so enlightened that when I die, I'm not going anywhere. I'm coming back to help other people get enlightened. Right? It's a value take, right? And a bodhisattva vow... Classically, could be any number of things. It could be like... I will not accept enlightenment. I will not accept liberation
because in their religion, once you're enlightened, you don't come back again.
Right.
Like the Buddhists, they said the Buddha doesn't come back.
Right.
Didn't come back after he died because he reached enlightenment,
right.
And so he goes to nirvana, and he doesn't come back in another form.
Right. So that does seem to shift this sort of focus onto things like benevolence, things like loving kindness, things like compassion. And so the Buddha, this part of what he's trying to tell you is that then the Buddhist teachings
less
start
egotistical
to focus on not just these sort of core teachings about the Four Noble Truths and tempering your craving, tempering your desire in order to be able to avoid the poison of suffering, right? To then really, what are the ways of leading a good bodhisattva life that actually does contribute to the enlightenment
Here's
of all
when we get
beings?
to our question.
Right.
How do you live that good life?
Exactly.
And in the Buddhist side, I didn't remember reading about moral stuff. It didn't seem like they broke it into 3 different things. It seemed like what were the ways that we looked at how to lead a good life? Do you remember? Like, how did they approach that question? Or how did Buddha? I remember it was from the Sittas. They took that when they boiled down, we're just going to look at the Sittas.
Right.
When we look at how they're answering this question. And I don't remember what the...
I'm in agreement with you. I wish he had given it a more thorough and organized treatment like he did
the Westerns.
Right.
But I wish I would have. I stopped taking notes when it got to Buddhism.
And part of it is he goes very quick. He talks about the...
I love those frames, by the way, Grant.
Do you?
Yeah, sweet frames.
He talks about basically he says the 6 perfections, skillful means, bodhicitta, Buddha nature, and emptiness.
Those are the ways that they answer that question.
Right, and that the cultivation both of the thought of enlightenment known as bodhicitta and the 6 perfections, and doing that in a skillful way, right? That's sort of what he seems to be talking about as but he doesn't go into detail about the 6 perfections, which is kind of disappointing because I think, these are generosity of giving, morality, patience of forbearance, zealous striving, focused mind, and wisdom or insight. I think enumerating the 6 perfections
and talking about them
might have been a better way to go about creating this comparison than trying to give you this large. I mean, not to second guess. I always try to tell my students when they're giving each other feedback on their articles and essays, don't give advice based on the essay you would want to write. Give it advice based on the essay they seem to want to write.
Yeah.
Right?
Right, makes sense.
And so maybe he has a different goal than I would here.
Right.
But I just think if our goal is to really establish the grounds of this conversation, maybe spending a little more time on those details, those specifics about how. But I think, it's a hard task. He's got 30 pages or so.
And he's presumably
and he's assuming an audience who may know very little about Western philosophy and Buddhist thought. So he
thinks this audience knows. I would think the audience would know a lot more about Western than Buddhism.
Maybe, but if you're thinking this is a book for first semester undergraduate freshmen in a philosophy class, So I think my sense, to be generous with him as an author, is I think he thinks he has to do a lot of that work to give people that landscape.
On Western side. And Buddhism side.
On the Buddhist side. And he's primarily doing that historically.
Yeah.
So it's too little and not enough at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Like he doesn't have enough space to really give you. So going back to your...
not enough is the same thing. You mean it's...
It's too much and not enough.
Too much and not enough.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, good. You shouldn't apologize.
I was like, he's the professor. He must be right. I was like trying to make it work. And I was like, no, that doesn't make sense.
It's too much and not enough. Yeah, exactly.
It's too much and not enough. Too much historical context and not enough getting down to the same way we were talking about Kant's ideas and Aristotle's ideas and Mill's ideas and how they got to the answer.
Right. I think he does that a little bit with Mill. Like there's enough there. I mean, it's too much historical context, but also not enough to get to it, right? Not enough of the details in general, and not enough on the 6 perfections, not enough on what's... And it's limited space, and those are hard decisions to make as a writer. When we read something like this, it's sort of like we can be frustrated by that, be like, oh, what can I learn here, and what's going to be helpful?
I'm with you on on love and compassion for the artist,
right,
for the author.
Yeah.
I think love and compassion, especially since he ended on Buddhism, he's prepared me to have a lot of love and compassion for him, and I have it. I think as we start to think about landing this plane, I want to get into a comparative aspect of this, because I mean the nature of the book is we're comparing these two. We've now talked about Western, we've now talked about Buddhism. So how do these relate, and how do they get us to a better understanding of this question?
So I think
answer it.
If I were going to answer that, I'd say, I think if we use the Western structure as the model, right, which seems to be where he's going, I do think if we're asking ourselves, how do we lead a good life, right, where we understand good to be a life of value, maybe a life that at the end of our life, not someone would say, oh man, he was happy even, but he was a good dude.
He's a good man, right? Or a good woman, or a good person.
That would be worthy, and going back to Aristotle, would be worthy of praise.
Yeah.
Right. And worthy of praise not just because people praise us, because that's an honorable life, but worthy because they should praise us whether they do or don't.
They should praise us.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I do think that there's different ways in which these two traditions think about this in different ways. And one is virtues, right? And there is a comparative, like if you look at those 6 perfections.
Those seems like virtues to me.
And Aristotle's virtues, there's an interesting dialogue. And they're slightly different, right? You know, Aristotle does put a strong emphasis on the reasoned life, but the Buddha puts a stronger emphasis on the virtue of real contemplative practice, meditative practice, which is one of the ways.
Well, isn't contemplative practice the same as like reasoning? Like isn't to reason to consider? They talk about it differently. Contemplative is stilling the mind,
right?
Time without thinking,
right? Yeah, there's a bigger understanding of mental events and the process of mental events and how we go through them
in Western side.
No, in Buddhist thought.
Okay.
No, I think part of why if you look at philosophy today and a dialogue between Buddhism and Western philosophy, the most interesting stuff is happening in philosophy of mind, right?
Okay.
And that's because Buddhism has such a rich, complex, 2,000-year-old, 2,500-year-old, really rigorous examination of what happens to my experience of mental events as I go through them in these meditational states, and then thinking through those and trying to organize them and create a taxonomy of different types of mental events and what follows from what and how they lead to truth or how they lead to delusion. Right? It's far more advanced than what Western philosophy has developed. Right?
And you think is that partially a consequence of the contemplative practice?
Yeah, I think it's a consequence of having monastic systems that are organized around that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where most of the learning is being organized and held and whatnot. Whereas ours was worked around prayerful practice, which is different than contemplative practice, right? Prayerful practice is more liturgical in orientation. It's in terms of
liturgical means
ritualized,
okay.
So that our monastic traditions in the West, whether they're the Christian monastic traditions or the Sufi traditions in Islam, if you want to think, they're organized much more around devotional practices.
Okay.
To God.
And you're thinking a specific thing as opposed to thinking nothing.
Right. Yeah. And so, that's one way I think that they're different. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there has been this very rich engagement with that. So I think that there is this sort of realization that if I'm going to lead a good life, I may have to engage in a kind of habituation of the way my mind works and encounters the world on a day-to-day level.
Some conditioning of the mind.
Yeah, to free myself from illusion.
And that involves some contemplative practice.
Right.
And in that contemplative practice, you come to the conclusion that you are not your thoughts. Because while you're sitting meditating, I'm proposing this, that while you sit and meditate, at least in the practices that I encountered, you see your thoughts, and in order to recognize your thoughts in your mind. And in order to recognize something in your mind, you have to be separate from it.
Right.
And then in that point, you realize, wait, I'm not my thoughts.
Right.
These are happening to me much in the same way I hear a dog barking outside. I am not the dog barking outside, although it is happening. I'm aware of it, and then I'm aware of these thoughts. They're not me. So then that gets us to maybe perhaps this like generation of rational agency.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And even larger than that. I mean, I think it's a whole set of things. It's even just realizing that like, oh, if I'm going to actually be compassionate in the field of my life, I may have to engage in some contemplative practices that orient me that way. Now, again, I think in the Western tradition that's been there, but that's been primarily in religion and often opposed to rational philosophy instead of understood as an aspect of it. So, yeah.
I just had this idea of someone going in to get a medical doctor going into one of their medical doctor classes and saying like, okay, we need to start our class and we're going to start it with a 10-minute contemplative meditation where you think about nothing.
Right.
And then at the conclusion of that, then I'll teach you about, how the kidney works.
Right. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. And I think that is happening in our culture right now.
Yeah.
I think that's
meditation
happening.
is definitely
mindfulness
huge. Mindfulness is huge.
Right.
Meditation is
and there's
huge.
ways we can be critical of this as like cultural appropriation and whatnot, but
I don't think it matters.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just good for the human.
Right. There's a level at which, we want to be careful and not fetishize it and not just turn it into another thing to market to people to make money off of.
I mean, that's just going to happen. We live in a capitalistic world.
Right. That's, and I think if we look at the history of Buddhism.
They just need the medicine.
Right.
We just need to do it.
Right. If you look at the history of Buddhism, the monasteries are a mess, right? They're like full of corruption and whatnot. No human institution is not going to be corrupt.
Because humans,
right,
it's just human.
Right. Part of leading a good life is, I think, recognizing that goodness is not there in the world. It's something you're bringing into the world.
Cultivating.
Right.
And yeah. Well, people might stumble onto good acts.
Right.
You might do it just like, haphazardly. Just, I happened to do a good act just because I don't even know.
Right.
But the idea of saying like, how am I going to act?
Right.
And then I'm going to act good. And then what is good action? And then at least choosing to err in the direction of goodness through some kind of process.
Right.
Presumably would get you closer to it.
Right. And especially if one of the things you think is important is rational reflection on it. Like, did I err? Did I not? Right. That's clearly got to be part of it. Right. And I think that's part of what Aristotle in the Western tradition produced. But I think the focus on also cultivating it's interesting when I teach ethics, towards the end, we start getting into care ethics and some other forms of ethics that have developed in the 20th century. And I'm just like, do you notice this is the first time people have been talking about love? And it's like, isn't that a little weird, right? That there's this huge oversight in the Western ethical tradition, at least in these traditions, in terms of focusing on like the actual loving relationships we have with each other as important locus of ethical action, right?
It's interesting. I in these interviews I've been doing, I've developed the questions. We've got 6 minutes. I've developed the questions through the family life, and I've asked folks like, "Do you remember having a felt sense of love with your mom? Mm-hmm. Do you remember times when you had a felt sense of love with your dad?" And it's almost like a foreign question to some folks that they're like, I don't. What do you mean? And they might answer the question in a general way, like, I remember my mom always drove me to the library or helped me do these things. But I'm thinking about like moments in time where you felt. So I don't know how we think about love as more than a I love you.
Yeah, because
what does it mean?
Yeah, I in my adult life have come to the conclusion that we often fail in love because we think of it as primarily an emotion, something from without us, some sort of like I love this woman because I've fallen in love with her.
Some passion, some emotional thing.
We use romantic love on that level as the like ideal of love.
Sense of like this person,
But I think to a totally different tradition, I do think the Confucian tradition hits the nail on the head in looking at family relationships. Right? And I think there's like, again, we have failed family relationships, but this is thinking about family relationships when they work in the way they seem to naturally be needing, like when they're naturally working well.
Yeah.
That sense of not just a felt love that I have toward my siblings, toward my parents, but also a sense of duty. Right?
Yeah.
But it's a duty that I don't take because I've decided upon it as a contract, but because I recognize this deep connection that is between myself and my family, right? And a lot of, I think, the expansion into the modern world is really expanding that sense of love beyond our immediate family to our nation,
community, and then just
beyond our nation,
like
to
you
the
would
world,
with a loving
right?
kindness meditation,
beyond humans
you
to
take it, all sentient beings,
exactly
to
the land, right? Going back to the questions you were talking before. Yeah. So I mean, if I were going to try to answer the question, what is it?
How to live the human good life?
How to have a good human life?
Yeah.
Increasingly, I'm just like, it's about the love, man. Like you got to focus more on the love, and I think recognize that love isn't going to save you. Like I think sometimes when people want to focus on the love, they're like, if you just love, it's not going to all work out.
No,
just because you got the love. But if you don't have the love,
suffering is a part of life.
You're missing something important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what's our next chapter, Grant?
What is knowledge? So
we get into epistemology.
Yeah.
In our next chapter,
which I'm excited about because Buddhist epistemology is the best.
Heck yeah. I've really enjoyed this, Grant. I'm really happy this is our first time to do this.
I know. I think I talk too much.
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe I could try to talk more next time, but I'm down to do this again. I love this.
We got 8 more chapters.
So I'm going to commit to taking notes on, maybe I'll just take notes on the Buddhist side next time and take no notes on the Western side. But thank you so much for coming. Absolutely. And I guess in about 2 weeks or so, we'll meet again and talk about what is knowledge.
Yeah.
Say goodbye to everybody, Grant.
Bye.
Whichever camera. Just say goodbye to every camera one at a time.
That one.
You get that.
Bye.
Kind of a hug.
I love you, man. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.